Evolution, Chapter 33, Too Far. Jen got the call on the way back to Earth. She detoured quickly, and Gwen frowned. She'd been in the back, checking on some of the minor damage Kevin had done to the ship. "What's going on?" Jen shook her head, praying they wouldn't be too late, but they were. They pulled into the plumber station, and Jen raced out of the ship and was met by a very familiar Apollonite. Varaxi bowed. "It is good to see you. I wish it were under better circumstances." Jen nodded. "Where are they?" Varaxi beckoned them to follow her. Gwen was beyond confused until they reached the med bay. Only Pierce was recognizable, since he'd looked mostly human to begin with. But his spikes were gone, and he was out cold, face twisted in pain. The girl on the bed next to him didn't look quite familiar. Her skin was pale, and she didn't look human. It took a moment for Gwen to recognize her. It was Helen. Looking drained, she too was out cold. Manny took up the last bed. He too was unconscious and pale. Jen turned to the doctor, one Gwen recognized immediately. How Albrasix, youngest prince of Apollo 1, had ended up as a plumber doctor so quickly was a mystery, but here he stood, datapad in hand, and a frown on his face. "They have been drained. Their powers are gone. I would not have believed it, but if Pierce had not called him by name, but it was Kevin." Jen nodded, hands curling into fists. "Can you help them?" Albrasix's frown deepened. "I can keep them comfortable. I cannot save them. Their life force is drained. If you can defeat Kevin, release the power back into the universe, it will return to its proper place, but without it, they will die eventually." Jen nodded. Albrasix bowed to her. "I wish our reunion had been more pleasant." Jen let out a slight laugh. "Me too. You look good, but I don't have time to catch up. Where's Alan?" Albrasix shook his head, running a finger down his datapad. "He was not on the same shuttle as them when the Academy was evacuated." He tapped a few times and nodded. "It appears the shuttle he was on made it away from Kevin. It is heading towards Earth." Jen nodded. "We need to beat him to Alan." Gwen was shaking as Jen thanked Albrasix, who took her hand and kissed the back of it. "I wish I could do more. I will watch over them." Jen nodded. "I'll beat Kevin." She grabbed Gwen by the elbow and dragged her back into the ship. They shot off at speeds that were inadvisable at best. Gwen was still shaking. Jen was silent until a light bloomed from her pocket. She pulled out the mirror Charmcaster had given it to her and tossed it to Gwen. Her knuckles were white on the controls. Gwen opened the compact and cleared her throat. "Oh, Gwen." Charmcaster sounded disappointed. "We've got a situation going on here. What do you want?" Gwen asked, her voice shaking. "Is Jen okay?" Jen spoke clearly and calmly, a kind of white rage under her words. "Define okay." "Well, you're alive. I'll take that as a win." Jen glanced at the mirror. "Look, I do like talking to you, but several of my friends are dying right now because of Kevin, so maybe later." Gwen made to close the mirror with a nod from Jen, but paused as Charmcaster spoke again. "I found the Librium." Gwen felt hope blossom in her heart. "We can still save him!" "He's not in there anymore, Gwen. There's nothing left of Kevin to save." Gwen felt her heart sink to somewhere near her shoes. Jen pulled the rust bucket into Earth's atmosphere. "You promised me I had a chance to save him." "He lost that chance when he attacked the team." Jen had pulled them over Alan's farm and flicked off her controls. She raced out the back of the ship, leaping into the air as she transformed. Gwen looked imploringly at the mirror in her hand. "Where is the Librium?" Charmcaster nodded and fired off an address. Gwen took control of the rust bucket and flew it away. She just hoped they wouldn't kill each other by the time she got back. Jen had managed to save Alan's life, but not his powers. She had several plumber agents protecting Cooper where he was waiting at La Soledad. She dropped off Alan at the base and took off on her motorcycle looking for Kevin. Her car had a tracker in it, but the one in the bike still hadn't been replaced from when she'd taken it out. She was going to end this, no matter what. She wouldn't fail anyone else. Kevin needed to be put down as soon as possible. Her comm beeped to life. Not interested in talking, Gwen. This isn't Gwen. Grandpa Max's voice echoed into her helmet. She shook her head. She couldn't talk me out of it, so she went to you, Jen said, talking over the wind around her as she sped down the side road and out towards where the Forever Knights had said Volcanus was hiding. At the moment, he was her best bet. He was her best lead on Kevin. She did call, yeah. Jen's eyes narrowed. And you agree with her? No. Jen frowned. What? Kevin's gone off the rails. He needs to be stopped. It's the logical move. It's the strategic move. It's what I'd do. But it's not your move. You never give up like this. You always find another way. You saved an entire race doing just that. Jen frowned at the thought of Riney in Kevin's position. Max continued. Kevin was a sociopath when he was a kid, and you trusted him anyway. Yeah, look where that got us. He's grown into a good man. He saved the world a dozen times. You should know you were there. Okay, I'm getting mixed signals here, Grandpa. He sighed. I am trying to make sure you know what you're doing. You do this, and there's no going back. This is something you can't undo. You know that. Once he's gone, there's no magic button that's gonna bring him back. Jen nodded. Yeah, I'm well aware of that. Good. I needed to hear you say that you know what you're doing. No matter what happens, I love you, kiddo. Jen nodded, pulling her bike into the mouth of the cave. Yeah, tell me that after I deal with Kevin. She clicked off her comm unit and sighed to herself. Gwen found her, and she brought Michael Morningstar along. He had kept part of the Dominus Librium and agreed to help if the machine could fix him along with Kevin. Jen fought them on it for a while, but it was mostly for show. If they could get Kevin into the machine, putting him down became infinitely easier and more humane. Gwen insisted on going in alone to get Kevin to come with them. It did not go well, but Kevin got a taste of Gwen's power, and according to Michael, that was the goal. Gwen was the bait to get Kevin to go where they needed him. Gwen's plan to talk him down, including Grandpa Max and Kevin's mom, backfired spectacularly, but it did get Kevin to follow them. Jen was glad Gwen had called in Julie. Kevin wouldn't go after her. She had no powers to steal, but when he tried to kill Cooper, she intervened as Ultimate Echo Echo. Surrounding him in the discs that blasted this version of her transformation's sound was easier than it should have been. He collapsed to the ground, unconscious. She floated one of the discs inches from his face. At this range, a single blast of sound at high frequency would liquefy his brain, killing him instantly. I'm sorry, Kevin. Jen, no! Gwen called out as Jen made to blast the sound into Kevin's face. He still hadn't stirred. Please, you promised me I got a chance. This is that chance. You have to let me save him. Her hands were glowing pink. She was ready to fight for her shot at saving Kevin. Tears pricking her eyes. Jen sighed. Either way now, there would be a way to stop him. She twisted the dial on her Ultimatrix and transformed again, this time into forearms. She hefted Kevin up and carried him into the lab. She hooked him up to the machine before the Ultimatrix timed out. Cooper was instructing Michael how to hook up the Dominus Librium into the machine. Gwen stepped in front of the controls. Move, Gwen. Promise me you won't hurt him. Jen stared at her, her eyes still cold. We're trying this your way. If it doesn't work, you know what I have to do. Gwen's face fell. Cooper stepped over to the controls. He was slightly bruised, but no worse for the wear otherwise. Jen stepped around her cousin and up to the controls. She and Cooper made a few adjustments and nodded to each other. Jen pulled the switch, and the power drain began. It did sound like it hurt him, drawing out the energy he'd stolen. But in moments, he was human again. Jen's hand hovered over a small switch set into the top of the console. Cooper frowned at her as Kevin blinked. Gwen, scraped and bruised, her shirt slightly torn, stepped up to Kevin. "Kevin?" Her voice was trembling. He blinked, dark eyes at her, confused.
"Gwen?"
Comprehension filled his eyes, and tears followed not a second later.
"What have I done?"
Jen's hand moved from the switch it had been hovering over to the release button on the restraints. Kevin fell into Gwen's arms. Cooper smiled. Michael cackled. He rose off the ground, skin turning golden as he grasped the Dominus Librium still attached to the machine. "Fools, all of you! This was my plan from the beginning. I wanted all this power to myself." Jen rolled her eyes as she flicked another few switches, and a panel lifted, revealing a red button. Like we didn't all see that coming. She slammed her hand into the button, and the Librium split in two where the machine was connected to it. Michael screamed as light filled the room, forcing everyone to close their eyes. Gwen held on to Kevin like she was never letting go again. When the lights died down, the room was far more crowded than it had been. Jen blinked at the Andromeda aliens that they thought Agrigor had killed. They were standing there, confused. Kevin was himself again, and Michael was back to his gray-skinned, sunken form. He hissed in rage and ran. Jen let him go. As she pulled out her comm unit, she called Albrasix, who was more than happy to report that the Max Force was making a speedy recovery. Gwen had thrown herself into Kevin's arms enthusiastically. Grandpa Max cleared his throat as several plumbers came into the building, primed their weapons, waiting for orders. Jen rolled her eyes. "Get them home, please," she ordered, gesturing at the Andromeda aliens, who were all very confused, but at this point just happy to be alive. Her hands were shaking, but she hit it well as the plumbers escorted the Andromeda aliens out of La Soledad. It took another few minutes for Gwen and Kevin to detach from each other. When they did, Gwen pulled Kevin to his feet, and he looked around, regret written plainly on his face. He turned to Jen. She shook her head. "We both said things we regret. Let's leave it at that and move on." Kevin hesitated but nodded, holding Gwen close. Jen turned away, and Grandpa Max patted her on the shoulder. "I'm proud of you for finding another way." Jen shook her head. "Be proud of Gwen. I had a backup plan to..." She left it hanging in the air as she stuffed her hands in her pockets. "Jen?" She turned at her cousin's call and just barely caught the mirror tossed her way. Gwen smiled. "Thank you for giving him a chance." Jen shook her head. "I didn't give it to him. I gave it to you." Kevin nodded, seeming to understand what she meant. He held Gwen a little tighter as Jen turned away and clicked the key fob for her motorcycle. It didn't need keys, just a plumber's badge or the Ultimatrix, but the key fob summoned it from wherever it might be parked. It didn't take long for the bike to show up. Max raised an eyebrow at her. "You okay, kiddo?" Jen looked over at him. There were tears in her eyes, and her hands were shaking again. "I need a break." Her voice broke, and Max stepped forward to pull her into a hug. But she had already mounted her bike and taken off out of La Soledad.